Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Battlefield Bad Company for Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. This is a first-person shooter and a spin-off of the Battlefield series. It was developed by DICE and published by EA in June of 2008 exclusively for consoles, and it was the debut of the Frostbite Engine, which has gone on, of course, to power Bad Company 2, as well as every other game that DICE has put out since then, with the exception of Mirror's Edge anyway, and this went on to become the engine of choice for all of EA's in-house development, although that's probably more for corporate reasons than anything else, but I digress. The game was released to a generally rather strong reception. Most people seem to enjoy it, particularly the destructible environments and the multiplayer, although I haven't really played all that much of the multiplayer simply because I don't maintain a live gold subscription because I have absolutely no reason to. And let me tell you, even if the player counts weren't pretty minuscule at this point, Bad Company wouldn't have been the game to persuade me to get and maintain a live gold subscription. But I'll get to that more when I get to the actual gameplay portions of this. But for now, let's take a look at the Frostbite Engine and the game that debuted it to the world. I have to say that visually the debut game for the Frostbite Engine is very unimpressive, and it would be much improved with the following release of Bad Company 2. But I guess it's understandable that this thing doesn't look particularly great because it was released on PS3 and Xbox 360, and they clearly had to make some sacrifices to get this to work acceptably on those platforms, because you're dealing with pretty low-res textures, and while the modeling is generally pretty good and the animations are also pretty good, there's a lot of weird quirks with this thing, like the weapons on screen being absolutely gigantic, and when you go to aim down your sights, they take up pretty much the entire frickin' screen, and that's particularly problematic considering how ridiculously low the FOV is in this game. Because I haven't seen any official numbers for what the actual FOV of Bad Company is, I estimated based on prior experience with various FOVs ranging from basically 45 degrees all the way up to 120 degrees. And I would estimate the FOV at this game being about 50 degrees horizontal. You have basically no spatial awareness whatsoever, and I'm sure that they rendered it at such a low FOV in an attempt to squeeze out as much performance in the game as possible, just by nature of not rendering as much on screen all at once. But the effect it has upon gameplay is extremely detrimental, and it's even worse when you're like me and you actually are affected by low FOVs. I have to reiterate this all the time, but basically anything lower than 90 degrees and I start getting headaches. After about 70 degrees is when I start to get into nausea territory, and by the time you get to the FOV this game has, I feel like I'm going to throw up after about 5 minutes of playing it. And that is not at all helped by the large amount of motion blur and having to whip the camera around all the time just because enemies are popping up all over the place and have to move around to actually engage them from all sides. And I just have to ask the question again because I am still utterly baffled by this. How the hell do you console gamers put up with FOVs so incredibly low? 65 is bad enough. That's kind of the standard for console FPSs. This is lower than 65, and it's extremely nauseating. I have absolutely no idea how you managed to put up with this. But anyway, none of this is particularly helped out by the fact that this is, of course, a game that is brown and gray and realistic. Pretty much everything in this is brown or gray, and when it's not brown or gray, it's a really washed out, nearly gray tinge of green. And it's just not appealing to the eye at all. And that's on top of low-res textures and a lot of really jagged edges on things because there's not much anti-aliasing in this thing. And then there's the problems that affect pretty much every Frostbite Engine game you can find, like overabundance of bloom lighting to make it where it kind of blinds you at times. Luckily, Bad Company 1 wasn't quite overboard on that yet, but on occasion it does get pretty nasty. So overall, the visuals are certainly nowhere near as impressive as later games in the series, particularly the jump from this to Bad Company 2, partly because Bad Company 2 got a PC release and thus they could actually crank up the visuals as much as they wanted. But at least it doesn't look terrible, and you do have the kind of cool environmental destruction to throw into the mix as well. You can use various explosive weapons in the game to destroy the walls and the buildings that enemies hide in, and it's pretty impressive to look at considering that this was a console game. But it does kick up a large cloud of dust and makes it kind of hard to see what you're doing when you actually manage to blast down a wall and such. But it does create some interesting gameplay dynamics that I'll get to more later on. Suffice to say, though, it is the sound design that really elevates the presentation beyond pretty meh. DICE definitely understands the value of having really strong sound design. Weapons generally sound pretty beefy, and they have this really nice supersonic crack to them as well. So particularly when you have a lot of weapons fire going on at once, it just sounds excellent. The explosions are beefy and concussive, and generally speaking, you're going to have a lot of just fantastic war ambiance simply by nature of the environment going from pretty much deadly silent to all of a sudden all hell breaking loose, echoing throughout the map. You got reverb up the wazoo. It just sounds great, at least as far as the sound effects go. When you get to the music and the voice acting, it's a bit of a different story. The voice acting generally works pretty well. Most of it's just average at best, but it generally works alright. They don't really do very good jobs on the comedic timing though, and considering they tried to make this game kind of funny, they end up falling flat on their face way more often than not. In fact, I didn't laugh in this game once. And while I'm sure some of you are going to be like, oh, well, DW obviously doesn't have a sense of humor, but the simple fact of the matter is that the humor in this game is not very good, and even if it were good, the execution of the voice acting just doesn't have the right kind of comedic timing and such to actually get it down. So when it comes to things like soldiers issuing call-outs to each other and all that sort of thing, it just sounds excellent, but when you get to the actual character-driven stuff, it ends up being rather tedious. And then there's the music, which is completely and utterly forgettable. In fact, I completely forgot what the soundtrack is in this game. Obviously, it takes a backseat to the sounds of carnage going on around you, and really that's the soundtrack that I'm far more interested in with this, because that actually gets you more into the mood of warfare than a standard action-oriented orchestral track that is basically the entirety of Bad Company's soundtrack. But as mixed a bag as the presentation can be, what really matters here are the story and the gameplay, which is actually kind of weird for this game because it's a Battlefield game and it actually has a storyline, because this is where the series pretty much gave up on the bot match single-player modes of previous Battlefield games and switched over to the Michael-based extravaganza that you see in Bad Company 1, Bad Company 2, and of course Battlefield 3 and 4. The thing about Bad Company is that it doesn't take itself anywhere near as seriously as Battlefield 3 and 4 do, and that's both a good and a bad thing. It's good in the sense that what you're doing in this game's campaign is completely and utterly ridiculous, and none of the plot even really makes sense. You play as Preston Marlowe, who is the new guy in a four-man fire team from B Company, which has become known as Bad Company, because it is made up of troublemakers who are basically just used as cannon fodder for the army. And you are unceremoniously dropped into a campaign where the Americans are fighting the Russians. Because of course it's Russians, right? Why wouldn't it be Russians? God forbid we try anything but Russians for the antagonists, right? That would make sense. Anyway, the reasons for fighting the Russians are extremely nebulous and really aren't explained at all in the game. So it's a good thing that that's not the actual plot of the game, because if it was, then that would be the most pathetic excuse of a plot I've seen in a modern military shooter in a very, very long time. But the actual plot isn't really any better. You end up running across a group of mercenaries that are known as the Legionnaires, who are apparently paid in gold bars, so your fire team gets it in their heads to go after the gold, and Haggard, the idiot pyromaniac of the squad, ends up running off into a neighboring neutral country, and of course ends up throwing a monkey wrench into this plan, and from there on out, the plot just goes all over the damn place and makes no sense whatsoever. But hey, it's clearly fine because this game has a sense of humor. Well, if you count the terrible dialogue and the fact that you had to fight your way through a golf course and can actually jump into a golf cart and drive it around for a bit, because obviously that's hilarious, right? The sergeant being only 3 days from retirement and constantly getting into trouble because of his squad is funny, right? In case you can't tell from the way I'm talking, no, it isn't funny. But obviously DICE think they're hilarious, so you end up with this situation where the game is just really not funny at all, but it's constantly going, hey, isn't this funny? Isn't this funny? Hey, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, funny, funny, funny. And that ultimately ends up just being kind of obnoxious more than anything else. So it really does fall to the gameplay to bring this thing up, because the plot's terrible. The characters are all pretty much stereotypes. You got Haggard, who's the crazy one. He's clearly the funniest one. You've got the sergeant, who is, again, 3 days from retirement. He will never shut the hell up about it. You got Sweetwater, who's a nerd. And then you got Preston, who's just a guy. because clearly that enhances the experience. But anyway, the gameplay itself I can pretty much sum up as regroup at the smoke, the game. The amount of times you have to regroup at the red smoke is downright ridiculous, frankly. But jabs aside, what you're basically doing every single level is get in a vehicle to traverse the very large open maps, which ultimately end up being extremely linear more than anything else. You do have a series of objectives that you can kind of complete in any order on several of the maps, but all roads lead to Rome, so to speak, and ultimately you'll end up completing them all anyway, so you're probably just going to follow the exact path that they pretty much set up anyway. And so it gives you a very thin illusion of freedom instead of actually giving you an open environment to complete your objectives in. And that does work okay for the most part. At least it doesn't feel quite as linear as most modern military shooters, which are basically just corridors upon corridors. This one's not really corridors so much as it's more valleys that you can run around in, and they ultimately still lead the same place, but at least they're more open. Not that that's really much of a benefit to the single player. If anything, it really just comes across as artificially lengthening the game. You'll spend a ridiculous amount of time just going from place to place instead of actually doing interesting things like getting into a firefight, for example. I mean, after all, this is a first-person shooter with some vehicle-based combat as well. You kind of want to be driving around blasting tanks and other things like that, as well as running around on the ground and blasting infantry, but you end up with rather long periods where you're just moving from place to place with no enemies in between, and it gets really tiring really quickly. Particularly when the game forces you to run around on foot because you move extremely slowly in this game. And that's whether you're simply walking around with your gun up or you're actually sprinting and your gun's down. In fact, the sprint is so underwhelming, I actually can't tell a difference between it and just moving around normally. It may not actually have a difference. It may just make you drop your weapon and wave the screen around a bit instead of moving you faster. But hey, even if it doesn't actually increase your movement speed, at least it gives you the illusion of doing something. But speaking of sprinting, you're going to learn something very quickly about this game, and that's that the controls are just pretty awkward and clunky. To give you an example, most first-person shooters these days on a console, you click the left stick and you start sprinting. In this, if you click the stick, it does nothing, because you have to click it and then hold it as you move the analog stick forward in order to actually sprint. And if you let up on the pressure even the slightest amount from where you've clicked that stick in and held it, you immediately stop sprinting. And for the life of me, I cannot figure out why they did this. Most games, because you click the button to sprint, it's like, oh, you're trying to try to sprint. Well, obviously that means you're going to want to go forward, so you don't need to push the analog stick forward and hold the button down at the same time. You just click the stick and you keep moving. And when you want to move in other directions, you can just move the stick to one side or another and you'll actually stop sprinting. Apparently DICE didn't get the memo, and thus your thumb actually suffers as a result. It's just not remotely comfortable at all, and considering how long the levels in this can be, if you have to sprint from point A to point B, it will take quite a long time, and on top of that, your thumb will get very tired very quickly. And that's not even the extent of the odd controls. Obviously left trigger is aim down sights or scope or whatever, and right trigger is fire, but you would think that like pretty much every other first-person shooter on Xbox 360, which is what I played this on, that the weapon switch button would be Y. Instead, it's the right shoulder button. Y is your melee button. You whip out your knife for a quick slash by pressing Y. And every time you press Y, your knife will come out and it will stay out. So if you need to immediately switch back to your primary weapon, then you have to hit RB for that. Clicking the left stick makes you crouch. The B button is your interact button. A is jump. X is reload. Left shoulder button cycles through your equipment. You may be wondering what the D-pad does. It does exactly one thing, and it only does it in multiplayer, and that's take a screenshot. And then you get into vehicles and the weirdness continues with things like left trigger being accelerate and left shoulder button being reverse. The controls are just weird, plain and simple. And it takes quite a long time to get used to that. And by the time you finally get used to those controls, you have experienced tons of, once again, regroup at the smoke of the game, as well as simply going from point A to point B and basically just attacking certain targets. It's pretty much all you do in Bad Company as far as the single player goes. You go to a certain point on the map, you destroy a certain objective, and then you move to the next area, and you repeat the process ad nauseum. There's no real variance in the objectives, and it ends up wearing thin extremely quickly. So you may be hoping for the combat to spice things up, and in some ways it does, in other ways it doesn't. This is a fairly slow first-person shooter, so you end up just kind of sluggishly moving around, shooting at whatever enemy pops up, and it generally behooves you to use burst fire in this because the recoil can actually be fairly substantial. And by that I don't mean that your sights are actually going to go rather high when you're firing. I mean that the animations shake the gun sights around so much that it actually makes it rather hard to see what you're doing, and if you do burst fire you can more quickly and easily acquire targets. Of course, when you aim down your sights take up pretty much the entire friggin' screen, so you have no peripheral vision, as if you had any peripheral vision anyway with the ridiculously low FOV this game has. So it basically ends up being a matter of flailing around looking for where the enemy is shooting you from and then trying to shoot them back before they kill you. Of course, death in the single player campaign doesn't really mean much of anything because you spawn right back at the last checkpoint and everything you did since that checkpoint is still valid. So if you wiped out pretty much every enemy on the map and it was just that one guy left who managed to get a lucky shot in, then that one guy will be the only one that's left. So really death becomes more of a nuisance than anything else simply because it sets you back to a location that you were at maybe 5 to 10 minutes ago, but everything you did still applies anyway, so it's not that big of a deal. And even then, it's ridiculously easy to avoid dying in this thing simply because you have a life syringe that you can use whenever you get low on health. You can just whip that thing out, use it, it automatically recharges over time, and by the next time you've got your health down low again, you can just whip that thing out and use it again. You got infinite uses on it. So the only real difficulty in this game comes from the fact that the enemies tend to surround you and hit you from all sides at once, and that the game will throw vehicles at you on occasion, and they are not really that easy to deal with unless you happen to have the rocket launcher or you're in a vehicle yourself. So the single player really ends up just being extremely tedious and mostly fairly easy once you get past the whole enemies have ridiculous amounts of accuracy and they hit you from all sides at once problem. And ultimately, the single player just ends up being a complete waste of your time. There's nothing to keep you there. And so you'll probably go, oh, well, it's a Battlefield game. Obviously, the multiplayer is infinitely better than the single player, right? Yeah, no, it really isn't. You see, Battlefield works best when it's a robust class-based experience that is also very heavy on combined arms warfare. While Bad Company 1 does have these traits, unfortunately, they are not remotely well balanced. Vehicles in this game are stupidly overpowered, particularly the helicopters. And sites such as this, where the enemy just spawn camps you with helicopters and tanks and such, and never lets you really do anything, are extremely commonplace. And the only way infantry can counter the vehicles is by playing the Demolition Class. Demolition Class gives you a rocket launcher of some kind, which takes a good 3 to 4 hits at least to bring down a vehicle, and by the time you've hit them once, they have spotted you and you're dead. But even if the vehicle doesn't spot you, you're at a huge disadvantage as the Demolition Class because their primary weapon is a shotgun, which has basically no range to it whatsoever. The other classes are Assault, which has an assault rifle with a grenade launcher attached to it, the Specialist class, which has a suppressed carbine or submachine gun, as well as explosive charges they can sit and then detonate later, the Recon class, which has sniper rifles, a pistol, and then a sort of recon grenade thing that they can throw, and it will supposedly mark things on the map, although I've never managed to actually get that to work for some reason. And lastly, the Support class, which has light machine guns and can also drop med kits or use a drill to try to fix vehicles and such. They basically tried to condense the class system from Battlefield 2 into this, and it really doesn't work all that well. They would get the class balance a bit better with Bad Company 2, but not much better. And what ends up happening with this is that you just have people playing whatever the hell they feel like playing instead of actually trying to work as a team. And when the Battlefield games have been about teamwork since the beginning, and this game doesn't really have much in the way of teamwork, it ends up just not working very well. You're supposed to have a variety of people playing different classes to complement each other's abilities and lack of abilities in certain respects. and yet that doesn't really happen all that much in Bad Company. You'll get the few people playing the assault class, you'll get a couple of guys playing support, and you'll probably get a couple of the particularly lone wolf kind of people playing the specialist and recon classes, but barely anyone plays demolition because it doesn't really have all that much use. I mean, sure, you can blast a bunch of chunks out of buildings, but really anyone with explosives can do that. I mean, the assault class grenade launcher is basically exclusively used for that purpose because it's useless for anything else, and the destructible environments themselves end up becoming something of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's a cool feature, certainly, but when you get down to it, the way the maps are designed isn't really conducive to that actually having a significant effect upon the gameplay, except in the Gold Rush mode when they put the gold cache in a building which the enemy team can then simply level in order to just completely destroy the gold cache without actually having to go up and arm a detonation on it. And that's really where the game just falls apart. There's only 2 game modes in this, Conquest and Gold Rush. I have only ever been able to play Gold Rush, which is frankly pretty disturbing considering that Conquest is the mode for Battlefield. Not a mode, the mode. And here we have Bad Company, where the only mode that actually gets played is Gold Rush, which if you played any of the Battlefield games since it, is just plain rush mode with gold caches instead of MCOM stations. One team has to destroy the gold caches, the other team has to defend against them until they have depleted their reinforcements. In Conquest Mode, you are given a series of points around the map that you need to capture, and if you hold them, then the enemy's ticket count, which is their respawn amount, will deplete over time, and the more points you hold, the faster the enemy's ticket count depletes, and that's the mode that Battlefield was designed for in the first place. When you get to Bad Company, it is painfully obvious they designed it from the get-go for Gold Rush. In fact, they had to patch in Conquest Mode. When the game launched, there was only the Gold Rush mode. And ultimately, I really think that is what speaks for itself here. This game was not really designed to be a Battlefield game from the get-go. And it's pretty painfully obvious when you look at things like the way the combined arms is so heavily skewed toward favoring vehicles instead of being a nice balance between infantry and vehicles. When you get to the weapons all behaving exactly the same in every single category, even though they're supposed to be a bit different. All of the assault rifles have 50-round magazines, all of them have grenade launchers, all of them are fully automatic. All of the carbines and submachine guns behave exactly the same. All of the LMGs behave exactly the same. They are all simply bullet hoses. You try to put down as much volume of fire as you possibly can instead of actually trying to get any proper hits. The only class that actually requires you to be accurate is the Recon class, because pretty much all of the sniper rifles are bolt action, so you have to fire it and then it has to go through a bolt cycling animation and then you can fire again, so you have to make your shots count. But that's pretty much it. And what ultimately happens with this is that you go into it expecting Battlefield, and what you get is this really weird, watered-down Battlefield to the point where it's not even really Battlefield anymore. It's a game centered around the Rush mode and not the Conquest mode. And it's painfully obvious. The player count is 24. Most of the maps are pretty cramped. The classes don't really work all that well together. It's just a mess. And even if you take it as just a first-person shooter in and of itself, it's just not good. It's got a sickeningly low FOV, the weapon handling feels awful, the single-player enemy AI is not very good, the actual difficulty of the game in single-player is pretty much non-existent, and then when you get online, you're probably going to run into a situation where you get spawn-camped up the wazoo by a guy in a helicopter and another guy in a tank or something like that. And for the life of me, I cannot see why people look at this as anything better than a ridiculously mediocre shooter at best. And most of the time, it doesn't even achieve that. It just ends up being a bad game in general. At least Bad Company 2 was a lot better than this. I will readily give it that. It had its problems, but it wasn't anywhere near as bad as the original Bad Company. They made significant improvements with Bad Company 2. But the original, not worth your time or money. I give it a 1.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.